be used to identify that person. So, what are some examples of personal data? Well, the most extensive list of personal data types comes from a regulation called GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, which was introduced in Europe in 2018 and was used as a basis for many other privacy laws around the globe, including countries like the US, UK, and Saudi Arabia, which use GDPR as a model for their own privacy regulations. GDPR gives us many examples of personal data which may be stored in electronic or paper format. This includes data such as name and address, email address, bank numbers, national insurance numbers or social security numbers in the States, employee ID numbers, driver license numbers, credit card and bank data, genetic data, biometric data, religious data, sexual orientation data, trade union membership, health information, criminal data, and IP and cookie information. While GDPR is fairly comprehensive, it does not cover every type of personal data that you may come across. Different industries, particularly in the US, have further types of personal data defined in healthcare, financial services, and education as examples. You may come across different terminology for personal data in these industries as personally identifiable information known as PII, or you may hear the term NPI, non-public information, in the States quite regularly. While in healthcare settings, you may hear the term PHI or EPHI, which is electronic personal health information, which refer to health patient information in the States. So where do we commonly find personal data? Well, a better question is, where is it not found in modern business setting? It's fair to say that the vast majority of it is stored in customer and employee databases and accessed via desktop and web-based applications. This particularly applies in business settings. For larger organizations, these databases can be spread out across the globe as different applications require access to it. So what are some examples of these applications? Well, common ones might be customer relationship management tools like Salesforce, HR benefits applications, integrated accounting and payroll packages like Sage, document management systems, and customer account management applications that you might see for utilities, online banking, airlines, education, and healthcare providers where customers can manage their own details. In addition to these applications, there are desktop applications like Outlook, Excel, and Word, which are commonly used to store and share personal data such as names, addresses, and other personally identifiable details. And lastly, then, there are physical records stored in paper format, which may be stored in filing cabinets or as patient forms, credit application forms, which we'll talk about later on in this training. But it's also important to note that this is only part of the picture for where personal data is found. You have to factor in devices like mobile phones, thumb drives, laptop drives, smart devices, and many more locations where personal data can be stored. We will see more details in a diagram shortly on this matter. So it's also important to be aware of certain categories of personal data as they are treated differently by data protection authorities, as they're considered more high risk and require greater vigilance in handling it. So when we talk about sensitive data, we tend to mean things like religious and political beliefs, sexual orientation data, trade union membership data, genetic information, medical records, and in many states in the US, social security numbers are considered sensitive. Then we talk about special category data in GDPR. We're talking about personal data of minors and criminal conviction data, which is required to be highly restricted in the EU. Access to criminal data is less restrictive in the US due to commercial reporting agencies who are permitted to sell such information online in the form of background reports. In any case, businesses must take extra steps to protect this kind of information by means of appointing data protection or chief privacy officers, which we'll discuss later, or implementing more stringent security safeguards, adding higher priority monitoring to sensitive data, and including more urgent components within incident response plans for treating sensitive data. From an individual sensitive data handler perspective, this means that extra care must be taken when processing this type of data. This chart is quite detailed, but it does show us the many places where you may be accessing personal data in the home or in the office. Viewers might be surprised at how many different places where personal data may be accessed from when using a laptop, for example. This makes it all the more important to be aware of when we talk about risks in upcoming lectures. So, looking at this graphic at the top in section 1, we show you some common desktop formats for how personal data might be saved and shared. Email messages may often be used to send attachments with personal data to customers, business partners, and service providers alike. Users may often work with a variety of file types, including Word documents, Adobe PDFs, Excel spreadsheets, and even image formats, which may be stored or shared. And of course, we also have to consider physical formats like printouts that may also contain personal data, as may be found in application forms and contact sheets. In section 2 of this graphic, we see an array of places where personal data may be accessed and stored from a typical computer. You'll see 6 common location categories where personal data may be stored and accessed. So if you work your way around from A to F in the graphic, you see drives, cloud locations, browser data, so things like cookies, IP information, and downloads, and then wireless devices where personal data may reside. An example of wireless devices might include other computers, wireless cameras, fitness wearables, and home entertainment systems that may be sharing and storing personal data. In this slide, we're going to talk about hackers and the lure of personal data. Personal data breaches have mushroomed in quantity in the last decade to a point where the official statistic in the US stands at 3,500 recorded cases of data breaches in 2024. This represents a 5-fold increase over a decade ago when there were just 780 cases recorded in 2014. So practically every online business in the US has been affected by at least one incident in the last 3 years where personal data has been exposed or breached at some point. So why the dramatic increase of data breaches over the last 10 years? Well, there are a few reasons, but they're mostly traceable back to the market value of personal data and the increasing sophistication of online attacks. As an example, stolen health records can now fetch over $100 per patient, while live credit card data can set up to $15 per card on the dark web marketplaces. When you factor in that many data breaches involve thousands of customers, you can see the potential for that ill-gotten gains can rise quickly. Hackers have also realized that after personal data has been stolen, they can further hold businesses and individuals to ransom by demanding payment to prevent the data from being publicly released or infecting the victims' machines with ransomware. It doesn't end there though. Cyber attackers regularly sell the tools and methods they use to hack businesses to other hackers on online marketplaces known as the dark web, where they can use it for further crime like identity theft, intellectual property theft, and Medicare fraud. In effect, cyber criminals have created an expanding criminal ecosystem with multiple revenue streams and virtual anonymity through the use of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. So where does the anonymity factor in? Well, it comes in from the fact that the dark web, everything is basically untraceable. Cryptocurrency is used, as I said, as a standard for payment, which is of course anonymous, while machines that connect to the dark web do not share their IP addresses or store any browsing history typically. So you might ask, are there particular individuals or kingpins responsible for most of the crime? Well, what we can say is that there's a higher likelihood that attackers are part of a criminal gang based in an unfriendly nation like Russia, North Korea, or China who may have links to the government. The link is usually very important to the survival of these gangs, as the governments tend to overlook their activities, if not actively support them for political reasons such as spying, intellectual property theft, monetary gain, and of course targeting adversaries. In the last slide, we took a look at the value of personal data and what happens to it. In this slide, we'll take a look at the top methods hackers use to steal personal data. The most common method, as you may already know, is phishing. Phishing, of course, is a method of using email to invite users to click on a malicious link or to deceive readers into taking another action, usually for financial gain. Phishing is the number one method for hackers in attacking individuals and businesses, and it's evolving. Attackers are using the power of AI tools like ChatGPT to automatically generate emails which are more likely to defeat email filters and convince users that the email is authentic. Phishing emails are a main cause for ransomware infections, personal data compromises, and fraudulent activities such as invoice payment fraud. As a result, end users need to be more vigilant than ever when handling emails, particularly from external sources. Next, we consider the term malware, which is an umbrella term for many types of malicious code, such as viruses, trojans, rootkits, keyloggers, and others, which may be a threat to personal data and delivered by different means, such as phishing emails, downloading from untrustworthy websites, sharing infected media, such as USB drives, and clicking on malicious links. Hackers know that the users will often be drawn in by internet search results like free downloads, such as found on gaming and shareware sites. Hence, again, users need to be careful about their browsing habits. The next hacker method that was commonly used today is password compromise. This is perhaps the most preventable hacker crime. Users realize that weak passwords are akin to having no password, and that the simple habit changes can deter privacy breaches. Hackers use automated attack tools to crack short and non-complex passwords in seconds. This is important to know for both your work and personal online accounts. Hackers know that many users will reuse many of their online accounts, so breaking one is like a skeleton key for breaking others. They also know that many users choose passwords with names, consecutive numbers, and easy to guess strings like password 123. So you have to be careful about how you manage passwords, basically online and in the workplace. Another favorite method for hackers is social engineering, which is rapidly evolving again in the advent of AI tools. Hackers are increasingly turning to so-called things like robocalls with more natural human-sounding AI-generated voices, all in an effort to call customers or call businesses and fool them into believing that they're talking to a real person. These scams are designed to get people to divulge personal information like account numbers, passwords, and PIN codes. They are all still, of course, real humans, often operating from scam call centers making these types of calls, trying to get some information through different methods such as impersonation of being a bank rep, investment advisor, tech support, etc. And then yet another area of attack for hackers is the area of Wi-Fi. Public Wi-Fi is often used by hackers to eavesdrop on electronic communications from your laptop, tablet, or phone. Hackers are always active on publicly available Wi-Fi networks looking for personal and confidential information that they can exploit. This type of attack is very difficult to detect, but fortunately is easier to defend against. Simply put, it's better to avoid public Wi-Fi and use private Wi-Fi with VPN software when possible. So looking at all these attack methods, there is a common theme, and that is the hacker relies on people's lack of awareness and letting their guard down to get access to personal and confidential information. Ensure that you are taking action in your decisions every day to prevent attacks like double-checking emails, avoiding untrustworthy sites when you're browsing, choosing strong passwords for all your accounts, and only using private Wi-Fi connectivity. Sharing personal data. As you've seen in earlier slides, personal data may be stored and accessed from many locations locally and across networks and regions. And the larger the organization is, the more complex the picture it becomes. As an example, a large multinational corporation might have several global call centers where customers can call in to discuss their account details and request documentation such as statements or make account detail changes. Other examples may include well-known companies like ADP and Salesforce, which process employee and customer data in their data centers all over the globe. There may be in fact hundreds of entities which companies share personal information with, such as legal firms for contracts and litigation files, service providers such as mobile phone companies for employee cell phone service, along with business partners, tax authorities, regulators, and accountancy firms, for example. So how are these records shared with third parties? Most of the personal data shared by businesses in and out of organizations is done through application update requests, which are transmitted automatically via secure protocols over local and wide area networks. There is also a lesser percentage of personal data transmitted manually via email, telephone, and regular mail with customers, employees, and vendors. It's not uncommon for employees to email spreadsheets, documents, and scanned forms with personal details to one or more third parties for further processing or review. So what do we mean by third-party risks? Well, as we've seen, businesses may use many established third parties to process their data from suppliers like ADP and Salesforce, but there are lesser-known suppliers like reward program providers and marketing firms that may also use customer personal data to do business, but they may not have as strong security and privacy safeguards. Security lapses at these third-party companies have generated major problems in the past main companies as damaging and embarrassing breaches have occurred and caused customers and regulators to question everyone involved in processing the data. The message is that businesses must ensure that their third-party suppliers respect data privacy laws and be checked regularly for compliance. Accidental disclosure and leakage. Well, not all personal data incidents are hacker-related or deliberate in nature. In fact, it's very common to see cases where personal data such as personnel records being accidentally published online or customer information being sent to an old address or emailed to someone with a similar name. There are also many cases of access permissions to sensitive files and folders, particularly in the cloud, being set to public accidentally. In the vast majority of cases, these are preventable mistakes which could be avoided through training and further checks and balances. So what about sharing risk prevention steps? Well, it's not possible to mitigate every risk with third parties or from accidental disclosure, but it is possible when you're working with personal data to contemplate and avoid a lot of them. When sharing personal data with third-party processors, ask yourself the following questions. Am I sharing the minimum amount of data necessary to perform the required task? Has the customer consented for this data to be shared? Is the consent still current? Is there a legal basis for sharing the data, such as contractual obligations, which we'll cover shortly in legal basis? And is there a mechanism to purge the data when it's no longer needed? Data retention then, as if you will. So when it comes to avoiding accidental disclosure, the key to success is practicing thoughtfulness. This means more double-checking of email and physical addresses for accuracy and checking permissions on files and storage locations before sharing them with anybody else. Protecting customer data. In the last slide, we looked at procedural steps you can take to protect personal data. In this slide, we'll look at more technical steps that are essential in protection of this data. The first of these is encryption. Well, why is this important? Well, in some cases, you may be sending personal data via email, which could present a problem if the information were publicly disclosed or hacked. It's important in a case like this that the email is encrypted via an improved method or service to protect its contents from hackers and preserve its confidentiality. Many organizations may encrypt email automatically via technical means, but it's not always the case, so you should ensure that encryption is enabled for all emails containing personal data. The same can be said for wireless connectivity at home. It's important to ensure that the strongest form of encryption is enabled, usually WPA2 or 3, in the home office Wi-Fi setting, and that you use long, complex Wi-Fi passwords which are changed frequently. I would actually recommend some form of password manager to manage all of your online account credentials, as it's not uncommon for the average user to have more than 40 online accounts. Remember that having a short password or one with names, dates, or consecutive numbers is no different than having no password at all, as it can be cracked very quickly with hacker tools today. This brings us to two-factor authentication, which is yet another important security feature which has become an essential part of personal data security. It's likely that you already have come across this feature when using banking apps or when requesting remote access into work, when you're prompted to enter a PIN or password along with the secondary approval steps such as a text message with a code. The point here is that passwords on their own are not trustworthy enough, and a second way of verifying your identity is required. If you're presented with an option for setting up two-factor authentication for accounts such as social media, Google, Amazon, etc., then go ahead and take the time to apply it. Safe storage and clear desks. Whether you're in the office or at home, it's important to be aware of physical data security around your desk area. What does this mean? Well, confidential material can be found on forms, printouts, printer trays, handwritten notes, along with portable devices including thumb drives, cell phones, laptops, which could all be vulnerable to snooping, copying, or theft. It's important, therefore, to keep a clear workspace and lock away documentations and devices when finished with them. The risk associated with this kind of vulnerability only increases the more public your workspace is, so such as a front desk or a high people traffic area or conference room, for example. Software updates are yet another important part of keeping malware at bay. This applies to all desktop and mobile devices, which includes applications, the operating system updates, antivirus, and browser updates. Why is this important? Well, hackers move quickly to exploit weaknesses in software, which means that the older the software is on your device, the more time they have to build malicious code to get onto your machine and extract personal data. There are a few other data protection practices to consider when handling personal data, which we'll briefly discuss here. The first of which is media disposal. Media disposal is a key but sometimes overlooked element in protecting personal data, as some may see old data and material as of no value, but that's not always the case, of course. As a precaution, it's important to cross-cut shred documents, or at least use confidential bins if available to dispose of old documents. Remember that end-of-life electronic media and devices need to be considered too in the disposal process, as they often contain gigabytes or even terabytes of data. Basically, it's never okay to dispose of devices in regular bins, as they could easily be targeted by opportunistic thieves. It's also extremely important to consider backups. Data backups are often the first and best form of restoration in cases of ransomware or hardware loss and failure. This is particularly important with customer and confidential data that may exist in the home office environment. You should consider backups to both a local and remote destination, such as a local backup drive in your workspace and then a remote cloud backup as a secondary measure. It's also best practice to test doing a restore as well to validate that the whole backup process works. Privacy screens or obfuscation filters. These may be a recommended addition for computer monitors so that visibility is restricted to only users who are close and directly in front of the monitor. This can be useful for computer users who work a lot with personal data on the screen, in public areas, or when data is highly sensitive on a regular basis. Another critical area to consider in customer data protection is incident reporting. It's like the old saying says, if you see something, say something. It's critical that incidents are reported quickly, even if they may seem insignificant, as they often can be telltale signs of something bigger and more sinister afoot. Examples might be suspicious emails, pop-up security warnings on the desktop, or slow PC performance or suspicious movements by office visitors. Vigilance is the key when it comes to prevention of security incidents. And then, of course, there's regulatory awareness, which is a sizable part of maintaining data privacy in the workplace. We'll delve more into privacy regulations in Lecture 6, but in preparation for that, it's important for data handlers to realize that there are many regulatory requirements such as only sharing the minimum amount of data necessary to perform the task being used and the concept of consent when using customer personal data. Most regulatory fines today are related to ignoring rules like these and not being transparent with customers on how their data is being used. Now it's time for a quick 3-question multiple choice quiz. Be ready to select your answer on each slide. Question 1. Which one of these is not an example of personal data? Choose your answer. And the answer is website address, as it's not public information. Question 2. How many breaches were reported in the US in 2024? Select your answer. The answer is 3,500. Final question, question 3. Which one of these is critical when deciding when to share personal data with third parties? The answer is authorization. Data centers must ensure that any transfers are authorized with a valid legal basis. Social media privacy risks. Social media, as you may know, does not have a great track record on the privacy front. Back in 2015, Facebook shared the personal data of over 87 million of its users with a company called Cambridge Analytica in London, who later sold the data for political ads targeting voters in the Trump election campaign in 2016. Cambridge Analytica went out of business, but not before it drew a lot of scrutiny from regulators everywhere. As a result, the seemingly never-ending stream of cases hit all the social media giants relating to things like password leaks, insufficient security safeguards, improper transfers of EU citizen data to the US, forced consent to use services, forced acceptance of cookies, lack of transparency in what happened to personal data, and much more. In fact, Facebook was hit with a record €1.2 billion fine for the aforementioned transfers of EU citizen personal data to the US without adequate security protections. But the problem didn't end there. Social media is somewhat of a mecca for all sorts of personal data mining and other nefarious activities. Hackers love public information, particularly where workplace information, email addresses, phone numbers, and photos can all be found in one place. They regularly use automated tools known as data scraping tools, which quickly reads this type of information found in public profiles, creates lists that may be used for identity theft, fake profile generation, deep fake image generation, and even reconnaissance for attacks on companies. Yes, hackers often do quite a lot of research on their targets before they strike, so gleaning public information from social media accounts of company employees can be very useful to them when crafting phishing emails, for example. This all brings us to yet another significant risk with social media, this time on the messaging front. Messaging apps make it easy to share attachments like images and documents. Unfortunately, it's all too common to see people take photos of credit card information, forms, bank account details, and other personally identifiable information and share it with others. The problem is that these messenger platforms retain these documents in conversation history, which it could expose the data if the platform or account ever gets hacked. These attachments can also contain malware, particularly hidden in PDFs, which can easily deceive recipients into opening them. Social media good practices. With social media, you can actually accomplish a lot of security objectives just by taking a few steps. One essential one is enabling two-factor authentication, which you've already mentioned 2 slides back. You can set up various methods of two-factor authentication, but the main thing is to enable it. This is a really strong deterrent against hackers, as passwords on their own are very crackable and may end up in lists on the dark web to be sold and later exploited. So when you are choosing passwords, I recommend a password manager to create and manage them, as you may have many of the features that you'll need, such as password change reminder, secure storage, and password field autofill features. There's also an extra step as a matter of good security hygiene, and that's conducting an account activity review, which many platforms like Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, and Microsoft offer. An account activity review is usually an option found under security settings, which will show you who is currently logged into your account and from where, giving you the option to end suspicious logged-in sessions and prompt you to change your password and possibly report it to the help desk. Also, it's always a good idea to review friends, connections, and third parties apps to see if they're still valid. Remove anyone and anything that seems odd or inappropriate, as it's always advisable to keep your risks to a minimum. So what about posting on social media? Well, awareness is the key here. Ask yourself, do I need to post details publicly about my employment, tag work colleagues, provide exact addresses or photos, with things such as license plate numbers on cars? At the very least, limit audiences to friends only. Be cautious about posting content that could be problematic if shared with your employer or future employer, such as images featuring drug use or posts about strong political or religious beliefs. Lastly, on this topic, messaging security. We spoke about the risks in the last slide. Here we want to remind you to avoid sharing attachments with any kind of personal data, and of course, not to click on untrusted links in messages. Hackers frequently use authentic or official sounding messages purporting to be from Meta, LinkedIn Security, etc., asking you to resolve an issue with your account before deactivation takes place. It's advisable to block the sender and report this to Meta or whoever it is via their official page and not to click on any links. Privacy law overview. In this section, we're covering data privacy law, starting with GDPR and then moving to the US and Canadian data privacy laws, which are very similar in nature. We've mentioned GDPR earlier in context of privacy law, but what is it? Well, keeping it high level at the moment, GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation, which was enacted in the European Union in 2018. It's a privacy law with 99 articles designed to protect the personal data of EU citizens being processed by businesses anywhere in the world. The main features of the law, which we'll cover here, include the 8 consumer rights and 7 data protection principles that companies must abide by when processing personal data. We'll look at the 2-tier fine structure, the Internet Cookie Consent Law defined in the e-privacy regulation, and how the US and Canada have adopted GDPR into their statutes. GDPR is filled with terminology, but there are 3 essential terms to understand when working with the regulation. They are the data controller, the data processor, and the data subject. The data controller can be defined as an individual or legal entity who controls how personal data is used by the business. The data processor, on the other hand, follows instructions from the controller on what to do with personal data. Well, finally, the data subject is the person which the personal data is about. There can be different arrangements with these roles in that you can sometimes have joint controllers and many data processors working with the same personal data transmitted from the controller. GDPR rights. So what are the main rights granted to individuals under GDPR? Well, there are 8 rights which are included in the regulation, which companies in the EU are obliged to honor for their customers. They include the right to be informed on how their personal data is being used and shared and any changes of use. Next, the right of access, which means consumers can request a human-readable copy of data that is held on file by a company. It must be provided within 28 days of the request and free of charge. Next is the right of rectification, which means customers have the right to correct data held on them, such as their name and address. Then there is the right to object to processing, so individuals can formally withdraw consent for continued use of their data. Then there's the right to restrict processing, so individuals can request limits to how their data is used, for example, restriction on third-party advertising from using their personal data. Then there's the right of portability, which means that customers can transfer the records to another organization, e.g. to another health insurance, for example. And then there's the right to be forgotten, where individuals can request their data be deleted. And then lastly, the right to object to automatic decision making. Customers can object to the personal data being used in automatic decisions such as credit or loan decisions. For companies, there are 7 principles that govern how they must protect the personal data of their customers. We show them here on this slide, starting with lawfulness. So lawfulness answers the question of whether a company has the right to process the data in the first place. So there are 6 legal bases that businesses can use to justify processing personal data. They include consent, contract, legal obligation, vital interests, public tasks, or legitimate interests. It's important to highlight that since customers must explicitly consent or opt in to having their personal data used when consent is used as a legal basis for processing their data. The term opt-in comes up frequently in GDPR, particularly when it relates to business websites when they're asking for consent to collect personal data about you. The second GDPR principle is purpose limitation, which directs companies only to use data for its intended purpose. This principle is designed to prevent companies from reusing the data for something else and for gain without the express permission of the individual. The next principle is data minimization, which requires companies only to use the minimum amount of data to get the job done. Then there is data accuracy principle, which requires businesses to maintain accurate personal data records at all times. And then the final 3 principles require businesses to 1. Purge personal data when it's no longer required. And 2, restrict access based on need. And then lastly, 3, meet accountability requirements. These accountability requirements include legal obligations where companies are expected to document all the data processing activities, implement appropriate safeguards, notify authorities of a data breach within the statutory 72 hours, and appoint a data protection officer when required. In this slide, we can see the fine structure for GDPR, of which there are 2 levels. Level 2 is for less severe violations and carries a fine of up to 10 million euro or 2% of the prior year's annual global turnover of the company, whichever amount is greater. Level 1 fines carry a fine of up to 20 million euro or 4% of the prior year's annual global turnover of the company. Level 1 fines can get quite high, particularly for tech giants who are essentially built on mountains of personal data. As an example of a Level 1 fine, Facebook, who had over $135 billion in revenue in 2023, was fined 1.2 billion euro for GDPR violations based on a percentage of their annual global turnover. So who is responsible for enforcement?